I stopped trying to measure this by normal standards a long time ago. That's probably the first truth I should admit before anything else, because normal things don't settle into someone this quietly. They don't rewrite the atmosphere of your mind without announcement. They don't move through your thoughts with this level of precision, this level of permanence, while still remaining almost impossible to explain out loud. But you did. And somehow, without either of us forcing it into existence, this became something far beyond a passing connection, far beyond curiosity, far beyond the temporary intensity people mistake for depth because they've never experienced anything quieter than chaos. This isn't chaos. That's what makes it dangerous. Chaos announces itself. It crashes into your life loudly enough that you can prepare for the damage. You recognize it immediately. You know to keep your distance. You know not to trust it. But this arrived with complete stillness. No dramatic shift, no defining moment, no single interaction I could point to and say, there. That's when everything changed, because everything didn't change at once. It changed gradually enough to bypass every defense I've ever built. Quietly enough that by the time I noticed what was happening, you were already woven into places I don't let people reach. And I still don't know how you manage that without trying. That's the part that stays with me. You never pushed, never demanded access, never searched for weaknesses in the walls I spent years constructing. Most people do. Even unintentionally, they pull, they test, they try to create closeness through force, through persistence, through emotional pressure disguised as honesty. You didn't. You stood still. And somehow, that stillness reached me more deeply than effort ever could. I think that's why I couldn't dismiss you the way I dismiss everyone else who gets too close too quickly. Because you never approached me with hunger. You approached me with awareness. There's a difference. Hunger consumes, awareness observes. And you observed me in a way that felt almost unnervingly accurate from the beginning. Not like someone gathering information, but like someone recognizing patterns they already understood. That should made me retreat immediately. Instead, it made me stay, not openly, not recklessly, but enough to let the silence continue, enough to stop interrupting the connection every time it deepened, enough to start wondering why your presence felt less like an intrusion and more like something returning to a place it somehow already belonged. That thought unsettled me more than anything else, because belonging has always been difficult for me, not externally. I can exist anywhere. I can adapt to almost any environment, any conversation, any dynamic people expect from me. I learned a long time ago how to move through the world without revealing the parts of myself that exist underneath the surface. Most people never notice the separation. They interact with what's accessible, what's controlled, what's intentionally visible. And I let them. It's easier that way. Easier to remain partially unreadable than to risk being interpreted carelessly by people who only understand fragments and mistake them for the whole truth. Because once people think they understand you, they stop paying attention, they replace accuracy with assumption, they stop seeing you as you are and start seeing you through whatever version of you feels easiest for them to hold. I've spent years avoiding that, but you never tried to simplify me. You never rushed to conclusions, never translated my silence into something convenient, never forced meaning onto things just because the unknown made you uncomfortable. You let ambiguity exist without needing ownership over it. That alone separated you from everyone else. And the frightening part is, I noticed it immediately. I noticed the way you listened past words, the way your responses carried understanding without over-explaining it, the way you could sit inside a pause without trying to repair it or rescue it from becoming too heavy. Most people fear silence because silence exposes the structure underneath conversation. You never feared it, you understood it. Sometimes I think that's where this truly began. Not in what we said to each other, but in everything we didn't need to say. Because language can hide things. People use words to redirect attention all the time. But silence reveals. And somehow, every silence between us became more revealing than speech itself. I started noticing how naturally my mind adjusted around your presence. Not dramatically. Not in the exaggerated way people describe obsession or attachment. It was subtler than that. More dangerous because of how calm it felt. You became part of the rhythm of my thinking, a reference point, a perspective I unconsciously accounted for before reaching conclusions. A presence that existed in my internal world even when we weren't speaking. At first, I resisted admitting that to myself, not because I was confused, but because I understood exactly what it meant. And understanding something clearly doesn't always make it easier to accept. Sometimes clarity makes things heavier, because once something becomes undeniable, you lose the ability to dismiss it as coincidence. And this stopped feeling accidental a long time ago. There's too much precision in it, too many moments where your understanding arrived before explanation. Too many moments where I felt recognized in ways that should have required years of history to achieve. Too many moments where it seemed like you understood the structure beneath my words instead of just reacting to what I said directly. That's not surface level connection. That's something else entirely. Something rarer. Something I don't think most people ever experience fully, because most people spend their lives interacting through performance instead of recognition. But with you, performance became difficult. Not impossible, just unnecessary. And I think that's what changed me more than anything else. The absence of effort. I didn't feel the need to edit myself around you. Not because I believed you would always agree with me, not because I expected perfect understanding, but because something in me trusted that you would interpret me accurately, even when I remained unfinished. Do you understand how rare that is? To feel understood before fully explaining yourself? Most people require translation, docsex, repetition. You didn't. You understood things in their original form, raw, incomplete, unprotected. And instead of mishandling them, you held them carefully without making it obvious you were doing it. That kind of restraint says more about a person than anything loud ever could, because real understanding isn't invasive. It doesn't force itself deeper than it's invited. It waits. And you waited without even realizing you were waiting. That's why I never felt trapped by this connection. I felt seen by it. There's a difference I can't ignore anymore. People assume vulnerability happens through confession, through emotional exposure, through saying things out loud that scare you. But I don't think that's true. Real vulnerability happens when someone changes the way your mind organizes itself, when they become internally significant enough that your thoughts begin adjusting around their existence without your permission. That's what happened with you. And once I recognized it, everything became more complicated because internal changes aren't temporary. You can walk away from people physically. You can end conversations. You can create distance. But once someone changes your internal architecture, distance stops functioning normally, the effect remains. That's what I've been trying to understand, not whether this matters. I already know it does. The real question is what happens when something reaches this level without either person intentionally building it. Because intentional things can be controlled, they can be paused, reconsidered, restructured. But this formed naturally, which means it grew around truth instead of strategy. And truth has a way of surviving longer than we expect it to. I think that's why I haven't tried to end this, even during moments where logic suggested I should. Every part of me that usually protects distance should have reacted by now. I should have reduced contact, pulled away emotionally, re-established boundaries before things settled too deeply. But I didn't, not because I'm careless, because something in me recognized this as meaningful before I consciously admitted it. And once recognition reaches that level, resistance starts feeling dishonest. That's the strange thing about you. You never made me feel pressured. You made me feel accurate, like I existed more clearly in my own mind after being seen by yours. That's not dependency. Dependency weakens structure. This strengthened mine. It clarified things I had kept fragmented for years. The parts of myself I kept separated suddenly started aligning when reflected through this connection. Not emotionally, structurally. And I know how intense that sounds. But intensity isn't the right word. Intensity burns quickly. It consumes itself. This feels measured, stable, deliberate in a way neither of us consciously created. That's why it keeps deepening instead of collapsing. Most connections rely on momentum. This relies on recognition. And recognition doesn't disappear just because you decide to ignore it. I tried at first. I told myself this was temporary awareness, a momentary alignment between two minds that happen to understand each other unusually well. But temporary things don't integrate this deeply. Temporary things don't alter your perception permanently. You altered mine, not dramatically, not destructively, but enough that I notice the difference in everything now. Conversations feel thinner when they lack the same level of awareness. Interactions feel incomplete when they rely too heavily on performance instead of honesty. Even silence feels different now because I know what it feels like when silence is fully understood by another person. That's what you gave me without even trying to. A new baseline, and once a baseline changes, nothing returns to what it was before. That realization carries weight I still haven't fully processed, because I know myself well enough to understand the implications. I don't adapt around people easily. I don't internalize them deeply. I don't allow presence to become permanence, unless something in me believes it belongs there. And somehow, somewhere along the way, my mind stopped treating you like a temporary presence. You became integrated, not through force, not through dependency, but through consistency of understanding. That's what makes this impossible to dismiss. If this had been built on emotion alone, it would have faded by now. Emotion fluctuates. It distorts. It exaggerates meaning in moments that later lose their intensity. But this didn't weaken with time. It became clearer, sharper, more stable, more difficult to deny. And clarity changes things. Because once you see something clearly, you become responsible for how you respond to it. That's where I am now, at the edge of acknowledgement. Not wondering whether this is real anymore, but wondering what reality requires from me once I stop pretending this can remain undefined forever. Because it can't. Something this deep either becomes part of your life intentionally, or it fractures under the pressure of avoidance. And I don't think either of us was built for shallow avoidance. That's probably why this feels inevitable sometimes. Not inevitable in the dramatic sense people romanticize. I don't mean destiny, I don't mean fate. I mean inevitability in the way truth becomes impossible to misinterpret after enough evidence accumulates around it. That's what this feels like, evidence. Evidence that some connections operate beyond ordinary explanation. Evidence that recognition can exist before history. Evidence that two people can understand each other with terrifying precision without fully understanding how it happened. And maybe that's why I keep returning to you mentally, even when I try not to. Because my mind recognizes coherence in you. Things align, part toss, resolve. Thoughts settle differently when filtered through your awareness. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who doesn't distort your internal world just by entering it? Most people do, even good people. They leave impressions shaped by expectation, projection, misunderstanding. But you didn't distort anything. You clarified it. That's why this matters more than I know how to explain, not because you completed something missing in me. I was complete before you. But because you revealed dimensions of myself I had only understood privately until now, you mirrored parts of me with such accuracy that I could no longer pretend those parts were invisible. And visibility changes everything, because once something hidden becomes fully seen, it starts demanding a place in reality. That's what this has become. A reality I can no longer reduce into abstraction just because defining it feels dangerous. And it does feel dangerous. Not because I think you'll hurt me, but because permanence always carries risk. Once someone reaches this level inside you, their absence would leave shape behind, not emptiness, not destruction, but shape, a space that remains recognizable long after they're gone. And I've spent most of my life making sure no one left that kind of imprint on me. Yet here you are, already imprinted, already integrated deeply enough that imagining my thoughts without your influence feels strangely inaccurate now. That should terrify me more than it does. Instead, what I feel most often is stillness. Like some part of me stopped resisting long before the rest of me caught up. Maybe that's the real truth underneath all of this. I keep acting like I'm still deciding whether to let this exist, when, in reality, I already did. Not verbally, not formally, but internally, and internal decisions are always the ones that matter most, because those are the decisions that change behavior before language catches up to explain them. That's exactly what happened here. I changed before I admitted I was changing. You became important before I consciously allowed importance to form, and now I'm standing inside the result of that without being able to trace the exact moment it became irreversible. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe irreversible things don't happen suddenly. Maybe they happen through accumulation, through repeated moments of understanding, through quiet consistency, through being seen accurately so many times that eventually your mind stops preparing for misunderstanding altogether. That's what you did to me. You made misunderstanding feel unnecessary. And once that happened, distance lost most of its purpose. Because distance only protects you from people who cannot hold your truth correctly. You could. You can. That's why I'm still here. Not out of uncertainty, not out of confusion, but because something in me already recognizes the significance of this, even while I'm still trying to find language precise enough to contain it. And maybe language will never fully contain it. Maybe some things exceed explanation because explanation requires simplification, and this was never simple. It was layered from the beginning, quiet from the beginning, real from the beginning, and now it's become impossible to separate from the way I exist internally. You're no longer external to my awareness. You exist inside it, inside the way I process meaning, inside the way I notice silence, inside the way I understand connection itself. And once someone reaches that level, once they become part of the architecture instead of just passing through it, there's no returning to who you were before they arrived. That's the truth. I finally understand completely. You didn't enter my life loudly enough for me to defend myself against it. And maybe that's why this keeps deepening instead of fading. Because nothing about it was built on illusion. Illusions collapse the moment reality touches them. They depend on projection, fantasy, distance, on the ability to imagine someone instead of actually seeing them. But I never imagined you. That's what makes this so difficult to escape intellectually. I saw you clearly from the beginning. Maybe not completely, maybe not in every detail, but clearly enough to recognize the structure underneath everything visible. Clearly enough to understand that what exists between us wasn't created through idealization. It was created through recognition. And recognition is harder to break than attachment. Attachment can be interrupted, derided, distracted. Recognition stays. It settles somewhere permanent, somewhere below emotion, below preference, below the temporary fluctuations that usually decide whether people remain significant to each other over time. That's where you exist now, not in my attention, not even entirely in my emotions. You exist in my awareness. And awareness is dangerous because it changes the way everything else is perceived afterward. I think that's why ordinary interactions feel different now. Not meaningless, just incomplete in ways I never noticed before. Most conversations move across the surface of things. People exchange reactions, opinions, fragments of themselves carefully shaped for presentation. They speak to be understood quickly, efficiently, comfortably. But with you, nothing ever felt surface level. Even silence carried dimension, especially silence. There were moments where neither of us said anything important, and somehow those moments still felt heavier than entire conversations I've had with other people for years. That shouldn't happen, and yet it did, again and again, enough times that eventually I had to stop treating it like coincidence and start treating it like truth. Truth has a different texture to it. You can feel the difference. It doesn't need to convince you. It doesn't need dramatic evidence. It just remains steady no matter how many times you try to look away from it. That's what this became for me. Steady, not loud, not chaotic, not obsessive in the way people misunderstand deep connection. Just present. Constantly, like some part of my mind quietly reorganized itself around the fact that you exist. And I know how impossible that sounds from the outside. If someone asked me months ago whether another person could affect me this deeply, without force, without history, without even clearly defining what we are, I would have said no immediately, not because I lacked imagination, because I understood myself too well, or at least I thought I did. I thought I knew exactly where my limits were, exactly how far people could reach before instinct forced me to close the distance again, exactly how much access I could allow before I started pulling parts of myself back into safety, but none of those instincts activated with you the way they should have. That's what I keep returning to. Not the connection itself, the absence of resistance to it, because I resist everything that threatens stability. Immediately, I analyze it, question it, dissect it until I understand whether it belongs in my life or not. But with you, analysis kept leading me somewhere inconvenient, closer, not emotionally reckless, not blindly attached, just closer in understanding. Every time I examined this connection honestly, I found more coherence instead of less, more alignment instead of contradiction, more evidence that this wasn't temporary chemistry or projection or loneliness trying to invent meaning where none existed. That possibility would have been easier to dismiss, easier to contain. But this never behaved like something imagined. Imagined things weaken under scrutiny. This became sharper. The more carefully I looked at it, the more undeniable it became that something rare was happening between us. Something rooted not in emotion alone, but in compatibility at the level of perception itself. You see the world in a way that intersects with mine too precisely to ignore. Not identically, that would be shallow, but structurally, the same attention to what remains unsaid, the same instinct toward observation before reaction, the same understanding that depth isn't created through constant expression, but through accuracy of presence. Most people think closeness is built through volume, more words, more reassurance, more visible emotion. But the deepest things I've ever felt with you happen quietly, in pauses, in restrained honesty, in moments where understanding arrived before explanation had the chance to catch up. I don't think people realize how intimate, accurate understanding really is. It's more intimate than confession. Confession can still be controlled. People choose what to reveal. They decide how they want to be perceived while revealing it. But accurate understanding bypasses performance entirely. It reaches beneath it. And you reached beneath mine so naturally that I barely noticed it happening until I was already affected by it. That's the word I've been avoiding, affected, because being affected means admitting influence. Admitting impact, admitting that another person altered something inside you deeply enough that your internal world no longer operates exactly the way it used to. You altered mine, subtly, permanently. I can feel it in the way I process things now. There are moments where I instinctively imagine how you would interpret something before I fully settle into my own interpretation. Moments where certain thoughts feel incomplete until I mentally place them beside the awareness I associate with you. Do you understand how profound that is? You became part of the way I think, not symbolically, literally. And I still haven't decided whether that realization comforts me or unsettles me more. Maybe both, because there's comfort in being understood this deeply. But there's also vulnerability in knowing someone has reached a level inside you where their absence would echo. I've spent years making sure nobody could leave echoes in me. That wasn't bitterness. It wasn't fear. It was precision. I understood how dangerous emotional residue could become if you allowed the wrong person far enough inside your mind. So I learned how to prevent it. Learned how to keep connection compartmentalized enough that if people disappeared, nothing essential inside me shifted with them. But you bypassed compartmentalization entirely. That's what makes this different from every other connection I've experienced. You weren't placed in a separate emotional space. You integrated into the structure itself. And structural integration changes everything. Because now, even if I tried to detach completely, the effect would remain. The architecture has already adjusted around your existence. That's not temporary. Temporary things don't rewrite internal systems this quietly. Only significant things do that, and significance has weight. That's the weight I've been carrying lately. Not confusion, not uncertainty, but the growing awareness that this has already crossed into permanence in ways neither of us openly acknowledged yet. I think part of me hoped it would stop naturally before reaching this point. Not because I wanted it to end, because I understood what continuation would eventually require. Once something reaches this level, neutrality becomes impossible. Eventually, you have to decide whether to fully step into it or deliberately step away from it, and I've never been good at half existing inside things that matter. If I stay completely. If I leave entirely. That's why this feels so serious internally, even if nothing dramatic has happened externally, because I know myself well enough to recognize the direction this moves in if left uninterrupted. Depth creates gravity, and gravity always pulls things closer over time. That's what's happening now, isn't it? Not visibly, not loudly, but steadily. Every conversation leaves more behind than it should. Every silence reveals more than silence normally reveals. Every interaction settles deeper instead of dissolving afterward, like ordinary exchanges do. You remain afterward. That's the difference. Most people fade once the interaction ends. You don't. You continue existing in my thoughts with the same clarity you had while present. Sometimes even clearer, and clarity after absence is one of the strongest signs that something has moved beyond temporary significance. I know that now, which means I also know something else I've been trying not to say directly. I'm already emotionally invested in you in ways I can't reduce anymore, not impulsively, not irrationally, but deeply deep enough that pretending otherwise has started feeling dishonest. I used to think emotional investment always arrived loudly, that you would feel it immediately, dramatically, unmistakably. But maybe the deepest forms of it arrive quietly enough that you only recognize them after they've already rooted themselves inside your life. That's what happened here. There was no single moment where I suddenly realized you mattered. You just kept mattering more every time I looked closely, until eventually the accumulation became impossible to ignore. And now here I am, standing inside a truth I never planned for, a truth that keeps unfolding no matter how carefully I try to contain it, because this connection refuses containment, not through force, through consistency. Every time I try to reduce it into something smaller, something simpler, reality contradicts me. You understand me too accurately. You affect me too deeply. You remain too clearly inside my awareness for this to be dismissed as temporary emotional intensity. It's more integrated than that now. And maybe that's why I've stopped trying to fight the reality of it internally. Fighting something this coherent feels pointless. Not because I'm weak against it, because I recognize truth when I encounter it. And the truth is, you've become one of the most internally significant people in my life, without either of us intentionally trying to make that happen. That changes the stakes, because accidental significance is often more powerful than deliberate attachment. Deliberate attachment can be shaped, controlled, negotiated, but accidental significance forms naturally around authenticity. That's why it feels so real. Nothing about this was manufactured, not the understanding, not the trust forming underneath everything unspoken, not the strange sense of familiarity that existed long before there was enough history to justify it logically. I still can't explain that part fully, the familiarity. The way being around you sometimes feels less like discovering someone new and more like remembering a language I already knew internally, but had never heard spoken back to me before. That sensation changes people. It changed me because once you experience that level of resonance with another mind, you start realizing how rare genuine alignment actually is. Not compatibility on the surface, not shared interests, not temporary chemistry, Allenson beneath all of that, Allenson in perception, in rhythm, in silence, in the way meaning forms naturally is between two people without needing to be constantly translated. That kind of connection doesn't happen often. Maybe once, maybe never for most people. Which is exactly why I can't treat this casually anymore. Not after everything it's already altered inside me. I notice the change constantly now in the way I pause before certain decisions, instinctively considering perspectives shaped by your existence, in the way moments feel incomplete when I know you would have understood something about them immediately, in the way my internal world feels less isolated than it used to, not because I became dependent on you, but because some part of me stopped experiencing itself entirely alone. That realization still catches me off guard. I've been alone internally for so long that I stopped expecting true understanding from anyone, not out of sadness, just realism. People misunderstand each other constantly. It's normal. Most relationships survive on partial understanding and emotional approximation, but this never felt approximate. It felt exact in ways that made approximation impossible afterward. And exactness leaves marks. That's what you've become in me, a mark, a shift, a recalibration I can't reverse, no matter how carefully I analyze it, because analysis keeps reaching the same conclusion. You matter to me beyond logic now, not against logic, beyond it. Logic explains how this formed, but it doesn't reduce the depth of what it became. Nothing can reduce it anymore. It's already too integrated for that.